The projector starts, and so begins this episode of Movie Nights and Matinees, a podcast for people who enjoy movies from when we actually had to go to the movies. I'm your host, Bill Groves, and this is episode 7, Tapping the Untapped, in which film historian Michael R. Pitts returns to discuss some of the movies profiled in his book, Thrills Untapped, Neglected Horror, Science Fiction, and Fantasy Films, 1928 to 1936. Make yourselves comfortable, have the popcorn ready, and let's begin.
With this, if what you say is true, what are you going to do with me?
I'm through with you. To me, you were just an experiment.
Well, you brought me to life. What's going to happen to me now?
If you're unhappy, I can kill you again.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for listening. This episode marks a milestone of sorts because it's the first one where I have a guest returning for a second visit. I'm joined today by Michael R. Pitts, who I actually had booked for this episode before I prevailed upon him to help me out with episode 5 when arrangements with my originally scheduled guest didn't work out. He graciously came to my rescue, and it's my great pleasure to have him with me again today to discuss his book, Thrills Untapped, Neglected Horror, Science Fiction, and Fantasy Films, 1928 to 1936. Michael, welcome back to Movie Nights and Matinees.
Good to be with you.
Let me just start by saying that this book, Thrills Untapped, may be one of the coolest movie reference books in my library. Right off the bat, it captured my imagination with that cover image from the Transatlantic Tunnel poster art of Richard Dix kind of glaring out as if to say, "Don't you dare not get this book." In any case, that's kind of the effect it had on me. So, after having written so many other books on movies, what prompted you to write this one?
Well, as the title says, it deals with neglected films. That was the main impetus. Over the years, I've seen a lot of movies that had either horror, science fiction, fantasy, or had subplots dealing with that. And basically, they're ignored in deference to some of the better known and supposedly more acceptable films in the field. So I wanted to do a roundup and cover a lot of these films that I felt had been neglected over the years.
What do you think were the reasons that the ones that made it into the book, generally speaking, what were some of the reasons that they were neglected, would you say?
Various reasons, probably viewability. A lot of them were not able to be seen after their release date until the internet came along. Sites like YouTube and Internet Archive and that kind of thing brought back a lot of these titles that people really didn't have an opportunity to see, or if they were out there, they were being sold on the market by individuals and didn't have they weren't in packages and so forth. So that's probably the reason.
Well, and you also include a number of films that are either partially or completely considered lost.
Yeah, that's another big problem, especially with the early sound and the silent era and the early sound era. So many films didn't get saved. And if it hadn't been for television coming along in the 40s and having such a voracious appetite, a lot more probably would not have been.
Yeah, and I noticed that one of the common elements in a lot of the titles in this book, well, there's a couple of things that I noticed. There are a number of foreign films. So for, your market, which is primarily going to be domestic, I guess, with this book, a lot of the films had foreign origins. Either they were foreign language films or foreign productions. And in some cases, there were English versions and foreign language versions done. And this is happening as silent was transitioning to sound. So in many cases, there would be a silent version released as well as a sound version. So given those variations, it kind of complicated which versions of the films would be most likely to be considered definitive and more care given to preserving them. And that's not even taking into account the early talkies using phonograph discs for their soundtracks, which was one more element subject to being lost or destroyed along the way. One thing I really liked about it, too, is that even within the title's description, the neglected horror, science fiction, and fantasy films, there are some subgroups in there, too. There are silent films, there are serials, documentaries containing qualifying elements, and, well, there's even some Tarzan movies, although a couple of those are Ken Maynard Westerns. Yeah, now that we've given the Western fans a moment to chuckle on that, for the people who are not big Western fans, I should explain, Tarzan was the name of Ken Maynard's horse, so there's that.
Which Edgar Rice Burroughs gave him permission to use, by the way.
Oh, I was not aware of that. That's an interesting tidbit. So, having set this up as your framework, what you were going for in it, how did you go about selecting or maybe even finding the titles that you decided to put in there?
Well, again, it was a situation of what's available and what resource material was available on various films. And films I simply felt were too neglected, had not been covered, not been given the credit they should be given. So it was kind of a combination of personal feeling and what was available out there.
What kind of breakdown was there, maybe just in terms of a rough percentage, or you don't even necessarily have to get that detailed, but in terms of movies you had seen already versus ones that you knew by reputation? Were there any that you really discovered in the process of putting together a book with this parameter?
Yeah, a lot of them were films that I have seen over the years, and when I saw them, it struck me. Now here's a horror subplot in this film. It's never been discussed by any of the other books that are out on the subject, for example. And so that I came across it that way. And again, films that I felt had been neglected or maybe touched on a little bit or needed to be amplified. For example, films which there were both the English language and maybe a foreign language version, and the foreign language version is quite obscure. So trying to bring out information on that kind of thing, too.
Yeah, and actually, that category encompasses several titles that were among the ones you indicated to me you specifically did want to talk about today, and also some of the ones that I'm particularly interested in talking about, those ones with the multiple language versions. So that's probably a pretty good cue to go ahead and dive into those and start chatting about them. Some of those can be grouped too, because there are some titles that you wouldn't necessarily think would fall into these categories, but as you indicated, they had some of these elements in them. And maybe in some cases, the word thriller might have been another term that could have been added to the title, because I think some of them fall into that, and they kind of walk the line between thriller / horror, that sort of thing. But there's a number of murder mysteries. Some of them featured some of the most famous detectives. You got Sherlock Holmes, you got Perry Mason, Philo Vance. In fact, I'll just mention, I noticed one of them you had in there, the Bishop murder case. The thing that stands out in my mind from that, and I'll be honest with you, I don't remember the plot all that well, but the thing that stands out, there's this moment where Roland Young is addressing Philo Vance, and I believe it's the chief of police.
Good morning, Osmond. Why, Holmes and Dr. Watson.
And of course, as it happens, the Philo Vance that he specifically says that to was played by Basil Rathbone. So that was kind of a priceless moment.
Who later went on to be Sherlock Holmes, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, that and losing sword fights is probably what he's best known for in the classic movies. So let's talk about some of those murder mysteries, I guess, to start off with. So right at the top, you've got The Black Camel, which is my favorite Charlie Chan movie, adapted from my favorite Charlie Chan book. It's also the earliest surviving Charlie Chan movie starring Warner Oland. It was the second one that he did. And it's almost the earliest surviving Charlie Chan movie, period.
Well, I agree with you. Probably The Black Camel is my favorite Charlie Chan film. And it and The Chinese Parrot are my two favorite Chan books. The Black Camel, basically, Earl Derbiggers, when he wrote the book, basically used the detective story as a camouflage for his take on the William Desmond Taylor murder case. And for our audience, William Desmond Taylor was a famous film director who was found murdered in his bungalow near Hollywood in early February of 1922, over 100 years ago. and that case has never been solved. There's all kinds of speculation, all kinds of suspects, but nobody. The case is officially open. And Biggers used the motif of the detective, Charlie Chan, to basically give his take on it. And his take was that a famous actress had murdered Taylor, his girlfriend, who in real life would have been Mabel Normand.
Yeah, and that is reflected in the plot of that. And there's a couple of other interesting elements to that as well. That one stands out because of the location shooting that was done in Hawaii, which
it's a very beautiful film.
Yeah, if anyone knows the background of Charlie Chan, he actually is based, at least in the novels, and then they kind of made him more of a world traveler in the films. But he's a detective on the Honolulu police force. And so this was at home, and it even shows him having dinner at this huge table with his family in one scene. So that's one of the interesting.
All of the Chan films, of course, were shot in Hollywood, except the Black Camel, which was done on location. And one of the nicest parts of you get to see that beautiful hotel where a lot of the guests stayed in the film, and the beaches. It's a lovely film to watch pictorially, in addition to its plot. And of course, the co-star is Bela Lugosi.
Right. And he brings in the element that I believe is the qualifying one for inclusion in the book, right? Because of his character.
Part of it.
You have flattered me by calling me a lifter of veils. Allow me to lift yours. Shall I say, Captain?
No. Inspector Chan, Honolulu Police.
Your business with me?
Rumor announced you have been sightseeing in Crystal Globe.
Yes, but not professionally.
Most happy. Because supernatural powers of fortune tellers make very bad smell in nostrils of Honolulu.
Perhaps, after all, my psychic powers may not be any more supernatural than yours. We are both detectives. You look backward, I look forward.
He plays a fake spiritualist who's actually the brother of the murdered man. And in the real life William Desmond Taylor case, there was a brother who disappeared. So, and then of course Dwight Frye, who played Renfield in Dracula, also has a supporting role in the film.
Right, and that was the same year, wasn't it? Weren't they both 1931? Yes,
Dracula came out early in 31, and the Black Camel came out later in the year.
So, yeah, those are some of the things. And one other just interesting element, too. People who become fans of the Charlie Chan movies, a lot of times one of the things they really remember about it and enjoy about it was Key Luke playing number one's son. Well, he didn't really have anything to do in the novels. But in this novel, there was an assistant named Kashimo who was Japanese, and he does show up in this movie, although in the novel, there's some humor attached to him as a somewhat bumbling assistant to Chan, but it's really exaggerated in the movie. I mean, it's a bit over the top.
Lou, what case? No case, just clues. I'm pretending to be Chinese merchant. Do not mention police. Go away. You want me to investigate? Yes. Take streetcar. Go far away. Investigate there long time. And remember, wages of stupidity is hunt for new job. Oh, I understand. Thank you so much.
Yeah, he's probably the low point of the film, that pesky character that he played, yes.
Yeah. Okay, so that's one of actually two Charlie Chan films that appear in the book. Now, there's another murder mystery in there that I was completely unfamiliar with, called Bombay Mail. So tell us about that one.
Okay, Bombay Mail was a Universal, and it came out during the time period that Universal was making the horror classics, and it starred one of the most popular actors of that period, Edmund Lowe, as a detective. And again, it's basically a murder mystery on a train, but it has several horror elements. And there's a scene in it which I will not describe because I don't want to ruin it for people who go to see the Bombay Mail. But it's got such a shock effect that it's as horrific as anything in Frankenstein or Dracula.
I'm going to have to double check with you. I think maybe I know which one you're talking about, but I'll have to ask you off mic if I'm right about that, because like you, I don't want to spoil it if I'm right. And if I'm wrong, I'm curious to know which scene that is. But no, go ahead.
It's a very flavorful mystery, and it's got an aura of horror about it. There's a murder on a train heading to Bombay in India. You have all kinds of different suspects, and it's very well acted. And like the train, it moves quickly. It's a very fast-moving film. Edwin Lowe actually doesn't show up until about 20 minutes into the film, but after that, he completely dominates it.
That young lady is Beatrice Jones. Take her to the private car and keep her in custody till I question her.
Yes.
Anderson.
Yes, sir.
Get some stretcher bearers and have Sir Anthony's body taken to the private car.
Yes, sir.
Surely you're not thinking of taking a dead body across India at this time of year?
We can't hold the mail, Doctor. I will be forced to continue my investigations en route.
Perhaps you wouldn't mind telling me why I'm being ordered to the private car, Inspector.
So we can be together, Miss Jones.
What?
While I question you. In regard to the murder of the governor of Bengal.
Although it was not a part of the shock theater package that Screen Gems put out, TV stations often augmented it with those horror films. So it got kind of a reputation back in the day as kind of a semi-horror picture. And today, that's one of the reasons I included it.
And there's another, I'll just do a little aside here, that of the films that you thought was worthy of discussing, but it's not really available per se to watch, but also involves a train, and that's the Ghost Train.
Ghost Train, well, there's so many versions of Ghost Train. The book encompasses the years 1928 to 36. Maybe I should explain why. 1928 was basically the beginning of the sound era. And 1936 was the year that the British horror ban pretty much took a place in the United States and cut off a lot of production of horror pictures. So I included those dates of the films within that time period.
And the Ghost Train is one of those that's partially lost. Yeah,
there's 4 reels that survive, and only 2 of those have sound. The thing of it is, there are so many other versions of the Ghost Train that you can watch them and get the plot, and they all pretty much stick close to Arthur Ridley's play. There's a 41 version of the Ghost Train. Walter Ford directed both the 33 and 41 versions of Ghost Train. The only problem with that film is Arthur Askey as the lead comedian. Well, you either like him or you don't. And outside of that, there's a good Dutch version called Die Spooktrein, and there were Hungarian versions, there was a Romanian version, there was even a Japanese version in the early 50s. So there are quite a few versions of Ghost Train out there.
I guess the reason there's that many is because it does, as you mentioned, stem from a play rather than it being a case of, one movie being remade over and over in a lot of different venues.
Well, I was going to say the 33 version of Spook Train, the Hungarian and Romanian versions take footage from the English version, and then they reshot the acting sequences. But the action parts of those films are from the British version.
Yeah, and that's something else that was common in that era, too, when there were these multi-language, multi-country versions of films being done more or less simultaneously or, backed up against each other, where they would utilize footage from the prior one. And then there's another one. Now, it's not exactly the same because this isn't a detective type story here, but, well, I guess we've already gotten away from that a little bit with Ghost Train, but Murder in the Red Barn. Now, that's one, I guess, is another one based on a play that's been done a number of times, but it's not one I was familiar with.
Well, of course, that was Todd Slaughter's feature film debut. And Todd Slaughter is, to me, one of the great joys of the cinema. His overacting, he always played lecherous, evil characters. And he started off with Murder in the Red Barn. Actually, it's called, the original title is Maria Martin, or The Murder in the Red Barn, based on a supposedly actual occurrence about 200 years before in England. But it was what they called a barnstormer. It was a play that played the provinces and all over the countryside. And he in fact, when Todd Slaughter died in the late 50s, it was the night after he did a performance of Maria Martin. So he was always one of the plays. But it launched his film career. He went on to do Sweeney Todd, Crimes at the Dark House, and a whole bunch of films clear into the 50s. He was the British boogeyman. He was Britain's answer to Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff.
Yeah, and I mean, he's one of those guys that you watch a story like this and you think, how could everyone around not immediately know this guy is no good?
You said you'd help me if I needed help. I need it now. But I meant what I said at the time, I swear it.
Is that why your banners are on the church door?
Things have changed with me. I'm faced with ruin. Prison. And what good will I be to you without a penny?
I'd be respectable.
This marriage is the only way out for me.
And what of me?
Why did you let your father find out?
Some things can't be hidden forever.
Does he know who the man is?
I don't know.
Wait. Let me think. I may be able to help. Wasn't there a young gypsy fellow whom you rather favored?
And what of him?
And didn't he make a fool of himself over you?
He loved me.
And with 100 guineas, he might love you again, eh?
What do you mean?
The day you and he wed, I'll give you a dowry of 100 guineas. Aye, gad, I'll give him a wedding present of 20 guineas into the bargain.
You'd have me marry Carlos? No.
It would be an easy solution to both our problems. And if afterwards you still pine for my society, well, Bury St. Edmunds is not a continent away. A rendezvous might be arranged, eh?
Oh, I hate you.
He always was able to emphasize the evil in a character.
Yeah.
And he had this laugh that was just very demonic. You could tell he was enjoying himself when he played these parts.
Well, it's interesting, too, because they had a very stylized opening in this. They actually introduced the players like you're in an audience in a theater, in a local community theater.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The management of this magnificent theater take great pleasure in presenting for your approval that sterling drama, Maria Martin, or The Murder in the Red Barn. Thank you. Thank you. And now, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce our players.
The actors are brought on. This is Mr. Todd Slaughter playing, the role and that sort of thing. So that was unusual. And then there's really a contrast, because once you get into the storyline, the actual murder scene, which takes place in the Red Barn, is very creepy and atmospheric.
Yes. The whole film really has a lot of horror overtones to it. But like you say, the murder itself is very well done. And it's like you were sitting in the audience and watching the play and feeling sorry for poor Mariah.
Oh, sure. Yeah. And this would probably be a good point to point out in terms of the way your book is structured. And this is helpful when you get to something like Ghost Train or another title that you discuss that's a lost film, is the way you've structured it. There's some variation in this, but generally, you have the full credits of the film followed by background on its production, people that were in it and so forth. And then you have a pretty detailed plot synopsis, which I tend to skip over, especially if I think I'm about to watch the movie. I don't want to, get the spoilers or anything like that. But in a case where the film is lost, hey, why not? Plow ahead. Read the plot and find out who done it that way, that sort of thing. And then it's followed by the critical response. You quote a lot of reviews, and those offer some good insight as to not only how the films were received, but particularly in the case of ones where they are lost, gives you a little more insight into how the movies played, performances and so forth. So that's really interesting. And there are a good number of photos and stills, ad artwork and things like that in there. So it's enjoyable in that regard.
One of the reasons that I do kind of detailed plot synopsis, the American Film Institute catalogs, I don't know if you're familiar with them or not, provide plot synopsis to films, and they do a good job. But many times, or sometimes, you notice that parts of the plots are left out for some reason. So I try to be more complete. And if a person wants to read the plot line, but I do like you do for something like that, when the plot's listed, if I don't want to know the plot, I skip over that part. Yeah. And I would advise readers to do that also. That's how they want to handle the film before they watch it.
And a lot of the films in the book, even though you may not have heard of them, surprisingly, a lot of them are available on YouTube. That's where I went to view a number of these. Now, the quality is going to vary. Sometimes you'll find more than one version that's been uploaded, and so you have to maybe try to find the best one. And sometimes there just aren't any great ones. And this is, again, where I'm a big promoter of physical media, because if nothing else, you don't have to depend on the internet staying up in order to watch something. I was like having available in the library to pull off the shelf and watch when I want to. But in any case, a lot of these are available on YouTube, and that's how I was able to see a number of these. Of course, that said, as usual, if you visit the Movie Nights and Matinees webpage, you'll find links to where you can make purchases of physical copies of a good number of these films. And of course, one of the additional benefits of that is that with physical copies, you'll frequently, if not always, get extras such as trailers, commentaries, that sort of thing that you simply won't get if you're watching it on YouTube. So focusing now on one of the specific subcategories that are mentioned in the title of the book, and that is science fiction. There are several titles in there that you and or I wanted to discuss today, and a number of them I had seen before, but recently had the opportunity to watch again. There's one, however, that I had never even heard of, and I was really glad that it was in your book because it prompted me to watch it, and it was kind of a revelation, and that's Cosmic Voyage. So I'll let you go ahead and explain that one.
Well, it's a Russian film from the mid-'30s and very well done. Of course, it's full of Soviet propaganda. But as far as the ability to project the science fiction quality of it, it's a good film. It's about a trip to the moon, and it's kind of parallels Fritz Lang's Woman in the Moon, which I also cover in the book. There's a lot of plot variances in both films that they kind of overlap. But it is a film worth seeing for people that like science fiction, vintage science fiction. It's a film to recommend. And again, thanks to the internet, it is available to be seen because it never got any release in this country.
Well, there were a couple things I was impressed by. One was the use of models in it. They did a really nice job of using models in ways where it's not always obvious that they're models. And in particular, there's this shot at the beginning. It's this initial dolly shot, and it's what you call the hangar of the spacecraft that's eventually going to be launched. And it's this long tracking shot. And it immediately reminded me of that opening shot in Star Wars of the revealing the size of the battle cruiser as it goes overhead. It was kind of like that. It's just, in this case, it's going laterally along the side, but it just keeps going and going and going. And it really conveys a good deal of size. Some of the other things that impressed me, there's a pretty good depiction of weightlessness in flight, and they make the wire work less obvious with the use of angles and quick cuts so that it's not painfully evident that they're using wires. So I was impressed by that. Although as they get close to the moon and they're getting ready for landing, they seem to have kind of forgot they were weightless because then they're walking around and everything's normal. But those are a couple of things that impressed me. And there's also an interesting use of stop motion animation for long shots of when they're on the moon and they're jumping around in the lower gravity. And so I wasn't expecting that. Now, is that one that you knew about before you got into this, or is this one you discovered along the way?
Difficult for me to remember, but I remember reading about it somewhere, and then being able to find it on YouTube and watch it, and also found a reference to it in a book on Soviet cinema. So that's probably the way I discovered that.
And another one that was on your list of ones to discuss, which I had seen before, and I just rewatched it again to refresh my memory, and that's the 1920, was it 28 or 29, Mysterious Island?
It was in filming for like several years. I think finally they got officially released in 1929. But you got to be careful with that because a lot of the prints are short. They're losing as much as 30 minutes of time. But that film is so impressive, and to me, especially the underwater sequences in the kingdom of those fish people.
Right.
In the film, that's very, very impressive.
Yeah, and although this is, I guess you could sort of consider it a follow-up to the silent version of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, it really departs from that in that this isn't Captain Nemo. His name's Count Dakar, I believe. It's played by Lionel Barrymore, the role. There's a thematic similarity in terms of his view of the world and war and things like that, which ties into the plot.
Hubert, I'm building a boat that will descend to the bottom of the ocean.
Many do that, friend Andre.
But this one is going to come up again. Oh, I've planned it very carefully, the work of years. It will succeed. I know it will succeed.
An armed vessel, Andre?
Of course. Who knows what perils we'll meet at the bottom of the ocean?
A ship that will sail under the sea to attack? Andre, with that, we could conquer the world.
If I thought my vessel would be used in the slaughter of mankind, I'd never build it. No, it's for science only.
It's not going to be comparable, say, to the one in the 60s with Herbert Lom, with the Ray Harryhausen animations. Different from that. But for the time, yeah, the effects are very impressive. And I remember those underwater creatures. The first time I saw that, I thought, okay, they kind of look like a cross between the creature from the Black Lagoon and Howard the Duck. But that is an interesting one to watch, yeah.
It is. It was a big money loser for MGM because it was in production for so long. It had like 3 or 4 different directors and some change in cast. It just never made back its cost.
One thing that stood out to me a little more this time, at least I didn't remember it from having seen it before, was Montague Love as the villain in this. I swear it looks like it's everything he can do not to twirl his mustache when he's performing his cruel villainy in the story. And then Gibson Gowland, who was the star of Greed and who was also in another one of the films we'll be talking about here shortly, he's in it as a crew member who plays a somewhat significant role, but not a big spotlight on him.
No, and that's a shame, too. The same thing happened with him in Phantom of the Opera with Lon Chaney. A small role, and then later he was with Bela Lugosi in The Mystery of the Marie Celeste. But Greed was his greatest role. And in my opinion, if I had to name the one great male performance in the silent era, I would name Gibson Gowland and Greed.
You know, I still have to finish Greed. I'm embarrassed by this, and the thing is, it's such a long movie. I just haven't been able to work up the stamina or find the opening in my schedule to do it. But I recorded it when it aired on TCM a few decades ago. And apparently it ran just a little longer than the schedule. And so final scene and my recording stopped. So there's probably 30 seconds left of it or something. I don't know. But I've never gone back and seen the exact end. So I've got it.
It's a very powerful movie. When I watch it in halves because it's such an emotionally draining film that I watch half of it and then take a break and watch the other half.
So while we're still in the sci-fi area, one in particular has fascinated me for a number of years. That's FP1 Doesn't Answer.
Okay, well, FP stands for Floating Platform, and that kind of gives you the story. Kurt Siodmak, who later wrote The Wolfman, a lot of the classic horror films in the United States, authored the screenplay. And it's about the building of an airport, basically in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And it was filmed in English, French, and German. The one, of course, we see is the English language version that starred Conrad Veidt. And it's a very well done and very powerful film. And for its time, the special effects and the construction of the film itself is very impressive.
I think what may have drawn me to it originally was just sort of the mysterious tone of that title. It's intriguing, although the original English title is simply FP1, but the German and French titles are translated as FP1 Doesn't Answer. You know, you said that the FP in FP1 stands for Floating Platform, and that had been my impression forever, basically. But then watching it this most recent time, apparently, at least in the English language version, that's not quite the case.
The FP1 will be an artificial island in the middle of the Atlantic, 1,500 feet long and 450 feet wide. At the focus point of the four worlds, halfway between Europe, South America, North America, and Africa, a floating aerodrome is to be built. An island of steel and glass. A haven for airliners within 12 hours flying time of the four continents. Halfway between New York, Lisbon, Monrovia, Pernambuco, FP1, flying platform number 1.
It's interesting that all 3 versions have an actor of note. Now, as you mentioned, the English production has Conrad Veidt, ironically, being, of course, one of the famous German actors. So he's there as the principal aviator character in the film. The German version has in a supporting role as a reporter or photographer, Peter Lorre. The French version starred Charles Boyer as the aviator. And unfortunately, that one apparently is lost, I guess.
And the interesting thing is that Carl Hartel directed all three versions.
Yeah, and I know there's some duplication of footage between those productions as well. Fortunately, the English and German versions are available together. There's a DVD and a Blu-ray set that have both of those. So that's good that those are so readily available. I wish that the French one would turn up. And it seems a little unusual that of the ones to be lost, it would be the French one, because so many lost films have turned up in French archives and things over the years that it's a little surprising that one didn't.
The German version, we probably should mention, starred the very popular German star, Hans Albers, who sings in the film, by the way. He made recordings of the songs from the film.
I remember singing in the film. There was a song that's sung over scenes of a group of aviators flying together, but I didn't remember him personally singing. It's, I guess, just been long enough since I watched it that I did not recall that. In a similar vein, too, and I mentioned this earlier, is with Transatlantic Tunnel with Richard Dix. That's another one where there were three productions. There was a British, German, and a French.
And again, all with named stars.
And the thing that I kind of pair these two together, because to me, they have kind of a Jules Verne type of sci-fi tone to them, because they're not, I've always drawn the distinction between Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, whereas H.G. Wells was the more fantastic, Martians coming, creating a time machine, that sort of thing. Whereas Jules Verne, his science fiction was more of an extrapolation of technology that already existed, whether it was an airship or a submarine or getting to the moon by way of a big cannon, that kind of thing. And these are kind of a similar thing. You might think of sci-fi, these are kind of sci-tech, where they're just a little bit further advanced than where we actually, were at the time. FP1 was released in 1933, and apparently the storyline takes place concurrently with that, whereas Transatlantic Tunnel, which was released in 1935, is set a few years ahead, because there's a reference to Richard Dix's character, the engineer, having previously completed the Channel Tunnel, and that's said to have happened in 1940.
I am only an engineer, putting up an engineering proposition. You may find it a bit fantastic, but I know it can be done. The proposition is the construction of an Atlantic tunnel between England and America. There'll be difficulties, of course. Most of them we already know, and it's quite probable that there'll be others. But if you'll bear with me, I'll try and give you the basic principles. What does make it possible is the fact that allanite steel has proven to be non-porous, even under the terrific pressures which we might experience, and the new radium drill invented by my friend Frederick Robbins.
And now in the case of Transatlantic Tunnel, it's a little more futuristic in that there's some new device called a radium drill, and there's some new kind of steel that they're using. But that's not that far out to imagine. So they do seem a little more grounded in reality as we know it than a lot of what we think of as science fiction normally.
Well, the British version also was quite a prestige picture. It was directed by a man named Maurice Elvey, who just prior to that had done a film called The Clairvoyant with Claude Rains and Fay Wray. And that had a big mine explosion scene, which is very similar to the finale of Transatlantic Tunnel. And also, the Transatlantic Tunnel had guest stars, which is kind of rare for that time period. The famous British actor George Arliss,
that's true,
British Prime Minister,
right.
And Walter Houston played the President of the United States. So there was quite a bit of prestige in that particular production, more so than the other two language versions.
Now, also, before we get on, there's another grouping that I want to talk about, but getting back to one I mentioned earlier was I mentioned Tarzan, and of course, somewhat in jest with Ken Maynard's horse, but the one in there that I do want to talk about And we talked about this a little bit in episode 2 when I spoke with Scott Tracy Griffin, but we only touched upon it really. And that is Tarzan the Tiger. This was the second serial starring a gentleman named Frank Merrill, who had appeared as a stuntman and character player in a couple of prior Tarzan productions. But then I think the original actor was injured early on in the shooting. And so he was recruited to play Tarzan in Tarzan the Mighty, the first of the 2 serials. And then this was the second one, Tarzan the Tiger, which was directly adapted from the novel Tarzan and the Jewels of Opar. And that was a little unusual even. Well, I guess maybe up to that point. I think the silent movies, for the most part, tended to tie themselves to the Edgar Rice Burroughs source material more so than would be the case in the Johnny Weissmuller era. But Frank Merrill was probably the most muscular Tarzan, certainly to that point. And I think even beyond that, the only ones you could really compare to him would be Gordon Scott and Mike Henry, for sure, muscles. It was basically silent, but they did record sound effects, which included the first Tarzan yell delivered by Frank Merrill. And it's a very unusual yell. He uses it in various ways. This thing that struck me when I saw it was this same yell is Tarzan's cry of victory, Tarzan's cry of rage, Tarzan's cry of stepping on a Lego. Actually, that last one would be unlikely because he's one of the few Tarzans that had footwear. He has these big they look like fluffy slippers, some that he wears. And the only other ones I know of that wore footwear like that, I think Johnny Weissmuller had some sandals in his last film, Tarzan and the Mermaids. And then Wolf Larson in his TV series, he had some footwear, which apparently makes a lot of sense because when I was talking with Ron Ely, this wasn't within one of the interviews I did with him, but I was telling him I had seen Arsenio Hall do a funny bit where he's talking about Tarzan and how he's running around in the jungle barefoot all the time, but he never steps in anything. And Ron confirmed that, yeah, if you're barefoot playing Tarzan, you do step in things. So that always stuck with me. But anyway, that was the last silent Tarzan. And he was the only actor who played both silent and sound Tarzan. Any particular thoughts that you have on that production?
Well, it's a very entertaining production. I think, again, because of the plot came from Burroughs rather than Hollywood screenwriters. It's interesting that there had been an earlier version of the film, and Lillian Worth played the Queen of Opar in both films. Also, Tarzan the Tiger did have some dialogue in it. Every once in a while, you get a few words on the soundtrack, which gave the studio then the ability to advertise as a part talkie or hear Tarzan or something like that. And, of course, there was music also, a music track. And one of my favorite things about the film, though, is the lead villain, Al Ferguson, who, in my opinion, is one of the all-time great villains of films, both in the silent and the sound era.
Yeah, I did not remember. It's been a while since I've watched it. I didn't remember any dialogue. Now, was it actual dialogue, or was it, for instance, in The Mysterious Island, I remember, which was basically silent with there were some dialogue scenes, but there were other scenes such as when they're getting the submarine underway and you hear the crew hollering, instructions at each other and stuff like that. So it's not really synchronized dialogue, but it's recorded dialogue. Was it along the lines of that in Tarzan the Tiger?
Yeah, just a few words now and then. Universal did the same thing in The Man Who Laughs from 1928 with Conrad Veidt, for example.
Another great one.
A lot of films at that time just put in a little bit of dialogue so they could say they were part talkies. And then sometimes it wasn't necessarily more than even a sentence or just a word or two, just so they could say they were part talkies.
Well, there's another, I guess, for lack of a better term, trilogy here that we can talk about, featuring Leni Riefenstahl. Now, she, of course, became infamous as, I don't know, what would you call her? Hitler's propaganda filmmaker or something like that years later. But before that, originally she was an actress, and then she transitioned into directing. And she appears in at least 3 of the movies in your book. If we do this chronologically, then I guess the first one would it be White Hell of Pitzpalu?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And that's actually where she started directing too, because there's probably the most impressive scene in that film is at night with the people with their torches going up the mountain to try to rescue the people that are stranded there. And she directed that scene. The regular director was not available for some reason, and that was her first taste of movie directing, and it showed that she had quite an ability to do so.
Yeah, I agree. That was the most impressive part for me. I mean, those nighttime scenes where they're recovering bodies of a group of climbers that got buried in an avalanche and swept away and whatever, those scenes are really pretty haunting, using the torches. And overall, that movie has a lot of impressive location footage on the mountains and some sequences that look like they were clearly dangerous to the climbers, and whether being portrayed as both climbers and rescuers. But I mean, whoever's doing it, actors, stunt people, or featured players on the sides of the mountain and ice cliffs and things like that. I mean, did anyone die in that production? I wonder.
Not to my knowledge. I've never read where there was any deaths or injuries in that, but they of course were very careful. But yeah, it would have been strenuous to have made those films.
Yeah, and then similarly, and this is where we get into another one where there were multiple versions done for different country, different languages, and that's SOS Iceberg.
Yeah, there were two versions of that, the English and the German version. What happened with that is that Carl Laemmle, the head of Universal, signed a deal with the German company UFA to co-produce films. This was in the early 30s, and SOS Iceberg was I think the first one that they did. Actually, the Germans had started the film and shut down production, and Universal took over after the agreement was done. And it's kind of an interesting situation because at the same time, they were also shooting two versions of a film called The Rebel with Louis Trenker. And in the English version of SOS Iceberg, the male lead is Rod LaRocque, who was a famous silent film star.
That's right. We actually talked about him in the last episode of his appearances as the Shadow.
That's right. And
what's all this about whether we stay or go on?
Listen, Dragon. It's taken us 8 weeks longer than we planned to get to this point. Brand has an idea it's dangerous to go on to the Rinks Glacier.
But
I know it's time for the ice to break up. But if we don't go now, it means waiting until winter, and I just don't feel like waiting, that's all.
The female lead in the English version of The Rebel was his wife, Vilma Banky, who was a famous silent screen leading lady. In fact, she starred with Valentino in his last two films. And so they went to Europe to do these films. Vilma stayed in Germany and made the English version of The Rebel, where Rod LaRocque then went to Iceland, where they shot SOS Iceberg on location. And Leni Riefenstahl was the leading lady in both films.
Right. She didn't have as much to do in that film. In fact, I think it was in your book that I read she didn't have as much to do in the English language version as the German. She certainly didn't have as much to do as she had in White Hell of Pitzpaloo.
Oh, very definitely. And Gibson Gowland, we bring him up again. He was in both films, and he has a much bigger part in the German version than he does in the English one.
Because he's pretty impressive in that one.
He is. He has a very good role in that.
Yeah, and it was interesting, too, because the English language version was directed by Tay Garnett, who I knew more from his work in TV Westerns than...
Well, he had a long career in both film and later in television, too. He was a co-director, actually, on the English language version.
But that's another one that's visually really impressive in terms of the locations and, again, the obvious hazardous nature of them. I mean, I remember one shot in particular, I think it's about 15 minutes in, where the actors, they walked through this, I don't know, pass, for lack of a better term, and then this huge block or arch of ice was crashing down onto the space that they were just walking through. Oh, wow. They are really pushing it there.
But look here, listen, Dragon. When Lawrence stepped on that ice, each step was loaded with dynamite. Those bergs roll over and drown the man in ice water. They can crack wide open and embalm him in tons of ice.
And there's a sequence fairly late in the film where one of the characters tries to swim for help, and he's going from ice floe to ice floe in this water. And I mean, apart from finding that hard to believe, because it just seems like he would get hit with almost instant hypothermia and there's no way he could make it. But apart from that, it's just unbelievable to think that the actor was doing those scenes, even in separate takes, just because it's obviously not soundstage work. It's clearly on location, and he's in very cold water swimming with big chunks of ice all around him. So it's just amazing to think that he was able to do that. But there it is. So now we come to the third film featuring Leni Riefenstahl. And in this case, she is not only the star, but it also represents her credited debut as the film's director, and that's The Blue Light.
Yes, that's correct. And of course, it's got a lot of supernatural motifs in it. The character she played was accused of being a witch, for example. But like the other two films, it was on location and in those beautiful mountains in Switzerland. And she did a wonderful job of capturing the local people and interpolating basically just a lot of the people in the film are locals. They weren't professional actors. It's a very impressive, visually impressive film. And she's very good in it. She was about 10 years older than the character she played. And of course, she lived to be over 100 years old.
I didn't know that. And from what I read in your book, too, that one wasn't all that well received by the critics, I guess.
Not at the time. I think in retrospect, it has been more than it was at the time. And also, you have to realize that they went through a period of there because of her involvement with the government, that almost anything she did was looked down upon. And
sure.
It took a lot of years for people to kind of step back and reevaluate her, kind of separate politics from the actual construction of films of which she was so very good. She had released her last film when she was 100 years old. She did an underwater featurette. So she continued off and on in films.
The critical reception just does bring one other thing to mind, too, is that there are movies in there that you don't even necessarily indicate are particularly good, but for one reason or another, they're worth knowing about and maybe watching just for their unusual qualities. Is that a fair description, you think?
Oh, yeah. The film doesn't have to be high class or good or anything like that to be included, because as long as it's got interesting aspects to it that people might be interested in or look at, is reason for inclusion.
And it's also the kind of book that, it's kind of the definition of a reference book, because it's not one you have to read cover to cover. You can pick it up and flip through it. If you think, oh, what do I feel like watching tonight? Oh, we'll see. There were some interesting titles in there. So let me read about that again, see if that's something I want to watch. It's a great reference book in that manner. And like I say, I discovered some movies here that I enjoyed watching that I wouldn't have known about if not for the book. So it's definitely worthwhile to add to a film buff's library. It really does fill a nice gap, just as the title implies, untapped thrills. So you can go tap them.
Well, one of the films I included that doesn't barely exist anymore is the Cat Creeps.
Oh yes,
from Universal in 1930.
You saw that skeleton key in your father's hand. You know what that means.
It means that you suspect my father. Think he's...
Until proven otherwise.
I didn't kill her, please believe me. But everything points to you. Even the cat. The cat knows. Take it away, I'll tell. I didn't kill Mrs. Williams, but I know who did. I'll tell everything if you'll just take the cat away.
And actually, The Cat Creeps was Universal's first all-talking horror picture. Dracula usually is given as the first, but it wasn't. The Cat Creeps was. But the movie doesn't exist anymore except for about a minute's footage. It was placed in a short called Boo in the early 30s, and thanks to that, we got that. But it was actually the film that set Universal on to making those classic horror movies, because if it had not been a success, Dracula or Frankenstein or any of the Mummy, any of those others that followed might not have come along. But thanks to the success of The Cat Creeps, and there was also a Spanish language version starring Antonio Moreno, the famous silent film star.
The trailer also survives. I found that on YouTube.
The Cat Creeps?
Yeah.
If you have, I've never seen it. I'll look for that. You may have put me onto something I'm not aware of.
Yeah, because I know the short that you're talking about, Boo. I have seen that. And actually, that was a sound remake of The Cat and the Canary, wasn't it?
It was, yes.
Why would anyone want to kill a defenseless old woman?
That's obvious. Either to force her to reveal the whereabouts of the 200,000 or silence her forever on the grand murder.
And Paul Kohner produced the Spanish language version, and he married the leading lady, Lupita Tovar. And their son Pancho later became a talent man in Hollywood. One of his biggest clients was Charles Bronson, and their daughter Susan was an actress in Universal films in the 50s. And then Paul Kohner then went on to make the Spanish language version of Dracula. Lupita Tovar was also the leading lady.
I was just going to say, yeah, okay, it all comes together. There's just so much good stuff in the book, and you've got a couple of the Lon Chaney, Todd Browning collaborations that are definitely worth people checking out. Where East is East and West of Zanzibar. So a lot of jewels in there. All right. Well, this has been fun talking about this. I really look forward to it because I've been absorbing this book for a while and not only enjoying it, but enjoying a number of the movies that it discusses. So normally at this point, I would ask you what your most memorable movie-going experience is, but I did that already. So I had to come up with another question. Hopefully this will be somewhat interesting. And that is, if you could rent out a movie theater, maybe one of the classic movie palaces or something like that, and invite a few hundred of your closest friends, what movie would you like to screen for them?
Well, there'd be a lot of them, but probably I would like to screen a film that supposedly is no longer available for screening, and that would be London After Midnight with Lon Chaney.
Ah, okay. All right. Well, yeah, I didn't specify a film that survives. Although on that topic, the one I'm really interested to see if it ever turns up is The Blind Bargain, or A Blind Bargain, I guess is the title of it, that apparently has an interesting dual role performance by Lon Chaney in that. And incidentally, just as a tease, I'm going to be having Lon Chaney expert / biographer Michael Blake on in a future episode of Movie Nights and Matinees. So that'll be something for fans of the silent genre or Lon Chaney or horror, et cetera, to keep an eye out for and an ear out for. That would be uncomfortable, wouldn't it? Anyway, so once again, Michael, thank you for joining me on Movie Nights and Matinees.
I thank you.
Remember that Michael's book that we've been discussing, Thrills Untapped, along with others he's written or co-written, can be scoped out and ordered through links in the bookshelf section of the Movie Nights and Matinees website. You can find more information about most of the movies profiled in the book, as well as links for ordering them in the screening room section. Also, don't forget to leave a rating and review for the podcast wherever you listen, and also pay a visit to the Movie Nights and Matinees Facebook page. Leave your thoughts on this or any of the other episodes we've done, and maybe start a conversation. If you have Michael's book, let me know what you thought of it, and if you're familiar with any of the movies featured in it, especially if you've watched them after having learned about them from the book or this episode. I'd very much like to hear your thoughts on the films. Well, that's all for now. It's time for me to prepare for episode 8, which, let's see, what should be my topic for that one? Maybe I should probably, I don't know.
This is ridiculous.
What are we going to do?
Road trip.